When we look at who are the food insecure in the U.S., food insecurity affects certain groups more than others. Typically, there are geographic barriers and geographic regions that are more prone to food insecurity. There are people living in certain socioeconomic conditions that are more prone to food insecurity, and also certain demographics that are more prone to food insecurity. When we look at food insecurity by state, this chart shows you where the most food insecure people are. The states that are shaded a darker gray have an above the national average number of citizens living in a food insecure state. The shaded ones are with the crosshatch are states that exist near the national average for poverty, and then the lighter gray states are states that are below the national average for people living in poverty. So what I'd like you to focus on in these darker shaded regions is this one particular kind of belt of states. This is part of this area is what we refer to as the Black Belt region. This is essentially where the poorest of the poor in the United States live. And when we talk about this region, we're going to include a more intensive case study. But I wanted to just point out to you that this is the region where a high density population of the poorest of the poor live. And we're going to see some of the implications of that. If you think back to the local news that you probably hear of obesity reports, these states are the states that are typically ranked the fattest states in the nation. They also have the lowest education rates, low high school graduation rates, high unemployment. And so I want you to keep in mind that all of these factors are fairly intrinsically linked when we look at the hungry poor versus those in poverty. So now I'd like to get back to who are the food insecure in the United States? What do they look like socioeconomically? Typically, the people that fit the category of being food insecure are the poor, the working poor, those in low income brackets. Also, farmers tend to be in this category. If you look over U.S. farming history, a lot of farmers, especially small farmers, have been bought out by large farming conglomerates. So there's not actually a lot of farmers that exist in the U.S. anymore. We also, of course, have homeless populations and ethnic minorities that typically suffer from food insecurity here in the United States. Demographically, those most vulnerable to food insecurity are the very young and the elderly. These two populations are most vulnerable because they typically don't have a way to secure food for themselves. So the young are dependent on their families to provide them food, whereas the elderly, a lot of them are confined to their houses and are dependent on people delivering food to them. And they may or may not know that they have access to certain resources of food delivery. So they typically also suffer from food insecurity. Other causes of food insecurity, again, it's intrinsically linked to poverty, which is also linked to under or unemployment, the cost of housing and other basic needs. So if you look at an area like an urban center where the housing cost is quite high, you would find more people are food insecure, particularly in regions that don't have, like New York City or Manhattan has, where you have rent control, so there are people that can afford to live there. You have other urban centers where if the cost of rent is continually going up and up and up, and people's monthly rent increases, say $300 or $400 a month, then that person can become and enter into a place of food insecurity. Other causes, things like lack of affordable housing, lack of education and employment skills. So if you remembered those Black Belt states, they also typically have a high dropout rate from high school, so they have less education and less skills available to them. So they become a less employable population. You also have things called food deserts. So there's insufficient community food resources. There are regions here in the U.S. where people live and there's not a grocery store for 100 miles. And so the only access they have to food is local convenience stores or local farms. And so when you look at people living very, very far away from a reliable food source where they can get good, nutritious food, they, depend on convenience store food. So, anything that you would buy at a gas station, chips, sodas, candies, and that becomes our main food resource. You also see a lot of these food deserts in poorer urban areas. So if someone has to walk 3 blocks to go to a convenience store versus 12 blocks to go to a grocery store, chances are they're going to walk the 3 blocks to the convenience store. You also have reluctance of people to accept charity. There's a lot of perceived stigma in accepting food stamps or going to a food bank. And so people are very reluctant, and some would rather exist in a state of food insecurity than to use the community resources that they have to access food available to them. You also see prevalence of mental illness, depression, and loneliness that can cause people to not utilize the resources available. And it also, alcoholism and chronic substance abuse leads to food insecurity.